All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. We're going to get into Bible Decode number 120 here. We do educational videos, mostly on topics that are off the beaten path, and in particular today, doing another Bible Decode from a book from Michael Menescot's that is called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And the Flavians were a dynasty of Caesars that ruled the Roman Empire from 69 to 96 AD. And Menescot's, M-E-N-A-S-G-O-T-Z, is one of several authors over the years who have posited a Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, that the New Testament was written by the Romans, not by the apostles or Luke or anybody like that, or Paul. They were written by the Roman Caesars. And I believe that the Roman origins hypothesis answers a lot of questions that otherwise remain a mystery, and they really get rid of all of the supernatural hypotheses that that scholars have to make when they don't have evidence. Then they go to supernatural explanations like God did it. But when you have the Roman explanation, then by Occam's razor, you have to say that the Romans did it, even though that might be slightly conspiratorial. But the three emperors that are in the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian and his two sons Titus and Domitian, were... The first two of them fought in a war against the Jews called the War of the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. And they were eventually turned into emperors. When Vespasian became emperor in 69 AD, he turned over the generalship for the Romans to his son Titus. And the Jews had been a big thorn in the side of the Romans for over 100 years prior to this. They were always insurrecting, revoluting, and uprising, and flat out warring against the Romans because they believed they were the special chosen people of God, and they had this jealous and zealous monotheistic God that had a whole lot of idiosyncratic rituals that the Jews had to follow, and other rules such as strictures against graven images and circumcision, and a lot of things that the Romans, they kind of rubbed the Romans the wrong way, because the Romans were trying to assimilate all of these different nations into their empire, and the Jews were the hardest to assimilate. The Jews were waiting for a Messiah as well in the first century. There had been a number of different candidates that had emerged, but they were really waiting for a Messiah. But the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for was a military leader, one that was going to come and raise up and take out the Romans, or whoever was the military, whoever was the imperial power that was controlling Jerusalem, especially at the temple, but Judea in general. They were waiting for a military leader to come and kick out the Romans. And that really happened in 66 AD. Some of the Jewish zealot leaders, Eleazar, John, and Simon, literally did kick out the Roman, the Herods, the Roman commanders. The Herods were like a puppet government of the Romans. And Emperor Nero had to send in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. And it took years to do it. This is at least according to the story that is the history that is written by Josephus in his book called War of the Jews, or the Jewish War. That is the subject of his 7-volume history. Now, the Flavian hypothesis follows from this. So the Flavian hypothesis is that the Romans intervened, especially Titus and Vespasian, who had both been military commanders and had both been injured in this war. And so they wrote about a Jewish savior and Messiah who was not a military leader, but instead was a prince of peace, and who believed in turning the other cheek to oppression, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and who believed in walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, and who believed in the greatest faith of all in all of Judea was a Roman slave owner, and who believed and urged his followers to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do, and who, when he became militant and stood up for himself, he stood up against the Jews and not the Romans. When he overturned the tables outside of the temple, those were Jews that he was revolting against, because the money changers were Jews changing Roman coins, which had graven images on them, to Jewish coins so that they could bring them into the temple. And overturning the commerce of the Jews who were selling pigeons and doves for the animal sacrifice rituals that occur inside the temple. And so Jesus was literally revolting against the Jewish rituals. And that is at least one piece of evidence that shows that he was a concoction of the Romans. Jesus doesn't do anything against the Romans throughout the entire Gospels or the entire New Testament. Paul is even worse. Paul is even more pro-Roman than Jesus is. But all of their ire is directed toward the Jews. So make sense of that. And then you can also realize that the Romans had a complete monopoly over publishing, over censorship, over distribution. And they spoke and wrote in Greek, which is the language of the New Testament. Unlike most people in Judea who spoke Aramaic, and very few of whom wrote in Greek, although there were some. Now, what Michael Menescotts does, now what the Romans did, according to the hypothesis then, is they wrote the New Testament in the 70s AD, but they backdated it by 40 years and put Jesus's ministry in the early 30s AD. And the theme is that they also wrote Jewish War, or Josephus's War of the Jews, at the same time that they wrote this other, and they are two of the same text. They are parallel documents that are intended to be read together. And when you do so, then you see that there are so many parallels between the two that they're kind of bouncing off each other. One is parodying the other, and the other parodies it right back. They're having a conversation with one another. Therefore, They were both written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. And that's what Menescats digs into here in this book, is that he looks at particularly the book of Luke, the third gospel, and Josephus's War of the Jews. In doing so, he was able to dig out over 250 parallels between the two. And he says that there are more there that he didn't find. But not only that, but he also graphs them out. So he makes a chart. He puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis. He puts Jewish war on the horizontal axis. And every time he finds a parallel, he puts a dot there. When he's done putting all 250 plus dots on the diagram, he finds that he has not just made a random pattern, but instead has made 5 near-perfect letters in Latin. APTVS. Titus and Vespasian, I'm sure, are the T and the V. Not quite sure what the other ones are, but the main point is that not only did the Romans write the Gospels, but they actually signed their names to them. And they're mocking us, who are now reading it and taking it seriously. This was a piece of wartime propaganda. It was made with contempt, mean-spirited, mockery, insulting, ridiculing the Jews and anybody who comes along and believes it in the future. I believe that the Gospels were mainly written for the Jews, and then the Pauline epistles were mainly written for other Roman hoi polloi, such as the soldiers and the slaves, and the other commoners that lived in Rome. So they were trying to convert them all. Now the Romans also, this is exactly right down their alley as far as method of operation. Their MO was always wartime propaganda, and they had created a number of other religions here in the first century. So this is exactly what the Romans would do, and it is not at all what a bunch of semi-literate followers of Jesus would do. So that goes into it also. Okay, so we're going to start looking at some of the parallels. Now, one of the basic patterns of the parallels is that what Jesus prophesies in the Gospels is fulfilled literally by Titus, the emperor, the general who eventually becomes emperor in War of the Jews. So the things that Jesus predicts or prophesies are fulfilled by Titus. Many of them. Some of them are fulfilled by other people, but there is a clear pattern of a few dozen that are fulfilled by Titus. The place where Jesus makes the prophecies are the same place that Titus fulfills the prophecies. The date that Jesus makes the prophecies are 40 years to the day from the time that Titus fulfills the prophecies. And they both have parallel. Jesus has a 3-year ministry in Judea. Titus has a 3-year military campaign in Judea. The places that Jesus goes during his 3-year ministry are the exact same places that Titus goes during his 3-year military campaign, in the same order. And the events that Jesus experiences in his 3-year ministry are the same events that Titus experiences, except it's just a conceptually. They don't literally do the same things, but conceptually they do the same things. But that's just one of many patterns. He also, Menescats went through a number of other patterns, including how Josephus, the character, not the historian, Josephus claims to have been one of the generals fighting for the Jews, until he surrendered to Vespasian and defected to the Romans. So he's an actual eyewitness character of this War of the Jews history that he wrote. And his life story also parallels the life story of Jesus. And Menescot's just got done going through that in exhaustive detail. So we're going to start looking at, I think, a slightly different set of parallels here from the text. Okay, so, and mirroring Luke, Jewish war describes a conflict at Jerusalem involving a metaphor for a cross, the clue once again being an emergence from below on the third day. So he cites here Luke 23:33 and to the end of the chapter. They crucified Jesus on a cross at a place outside Jerusalem. John associates this crucifixion with the razing or the destruction of the temple. Razing, R-A-Z, of the temple. Jesus was then placed in an underground cave, a sepulcher, and remained there until being raised up alive on the third day. And this is mirrored by Jewish War, paragraph 340 to 345. This is book 2, chapter 19, paragraphs 4 through 8 through 9. Cestius led the Roman army to Jerusalem and came and set part of the city on fire and attacked the temple itself. Some Jews fought the wicked Jews, that being the Zealots, are the wicked Jews. Some Jews fought the wicked Jews, seeking to accept Cestius as their benefactor, but were unsuccessful. So Cestius retired to his camp at Scopus, meaning the watchtower outside Jerusalem, and lay there all night. On being attacked, he retreated and was besieged at Gilboa for 2 days, finally retreating into the gorge of Beth Horon and losing a huge number of men. And in the night of that third day, he emerged to the surface alive, escaping to Antipatris. So the parallels there are Jerusalem, a tower, or crucifixion. He's comparing those two, which I think is kind of a stretch. The destruction of the temple, or burning it, the attacking on the temple, placing him in an underground enclosure, and then emerging on the third day. Okay, so that's certainly enough of a parallel to put a dot there, but it probably isn't enough to knock your socks off. Again, when you have 250 or more parallels, not every one of them is going to be a banger. Some of them are just there to put a dot so that fills out the pattern of the 5 Latin letters. I think there's enough there to constitute a parallel. You might not find it unless you are actually looking for it, though. But there are some that are completely obvious. And then some that are just genius, that are like so well hidden that you can't believe how many different parallels there are in just short passages. The New Testament is definitely a work of genius, but it is a work of evil genius. The Romans who wrote this were like the worst people that have ever lived on this planet, or just about. When you think of first century Rome, you think of debauchery, you think of cruelty, dictatorship, wars and killing. You think of one thing that you think of that isn't actually true is you think of persecution of Christians, but that wasn't really going on. What was going on was persecution of Jews. because there was a semi-permeable boundary there between Christians and Jews, that some people like James might have been seen as being a Christian, but he was really a Jew. And that's why he was killed. Okay, so, and mirroring Luke, Jewish War mentions Jesus Christ's crucifixion and describes an inscription being on placed on a post written in Greek, Latin, and implicitly Hebrew, and the curtain being torn, curtain of the temple being torn. So this is again Luke 23:33, and on to the end of this chapter. And there were 3 crosses, including 3 vertical posts, and they mocked him, questioning whether he was really the king of the Jews. And a superscription also was written over him on the vertical post in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew, reading, "This is the King of the Jews." And as Jesus died, the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in the midst. This is paralleled by Jewish War 553. This is actually only in the Slavonic version of Josephus. Book 5, chapter 5, paragraph 2. In the temple there was an inscription, and there were 3 equal pillars, and on them titles in Greek, Latin, and Jewish letters, warning that no foreigner should enter. And above these titles hung a 4th title in the same characters, announcing that Jesus the King did not reign, but was crucified by the Jews, because he prophesied the destruction of the city and the devastation of the temple. This curtain was whole prior to this generation, since the people were pious, but it was suddenly torn from the top to the bottom after they, via bribes, delivered the benefactor to death. Now, this passage, I am not completely sure that this is talking about Jesus, the same Jesus, because there are 6 characters named Jesus in War of the Jews, and they're all kind of a mockery of the Jesus of the Gospels. And so I'm not sure what is really being discussed here. There's certainly a ton of parallels, but this is not, I don't believe that this is about the Jesus in the Gospels, because that is a different passage that historians have acknowledged that is where Josephus, because Josephus is his book, this one, War of the Jews, is seen by Christians as being like the major corroborating evidence between the Gospels and the existence of Jesus. But this isn't the particular passage that they usually cite. So even though it does sound like it's about the same Jesus, and he was crucified by the Jews because he prophesied the destruction of the city. I wish he would explain that, but he goes right into graphing out the new passages, and they're all kind of in the T of the TVS, AP-TVS pattern. Now, this also brings up something that I didn't mention before, where, Jesus prophesies things that are fulfilled by Titus. That's kind of a poison pill, because you're thinking of Jesus as the Messiah, but actually Jesus is just the messenger who is predicting the second coming of Jesus, and that is Titus. Titus is the second coming of Jesus according to Josephus's history. All of the prophecies that Jesus makes are fulfilled in 70 AD by Titus, or in the early 70s AD by Titus. Okay, let's try to flip the page here. See what he has to say. Whilst chapters 1 and 2 described Joseph Atwill, author of the book Caesar's Messiah, which is kind of the first 20th century book that discusses the Roman origins hypothesis. In chapters 1 and 2 describe Joseph Atwill's discovery that Luke parodies the second half of Jewish War, the story of the 7-Year War, rather than the previous century, which is the first half of Jewish War. My goal in this chapter was to show that the second half of Jewish War parodies Luke right back, particularly involving the story of Josephus, the supposed author of Jewish War. Clearly, neither of these mutual parodies can be asserted to be the result of a few additions made by later copyists after the first century, because in both cases the parody involves a core narrative spanning the whole of one story, parodying almost the entire narrative across the whole of the other story. Okay, I'm just trying to see where we're sitting time-wise. Okay, let's start this next section here. So, what options remain for anyone wishing to argue against this evidence? If a critic were to say it's all coincidences, I can show that they are arranged in a meaningful and detailed pattern, which shows that they are intentionally there, since each one had to be positioned carefully. If a critic were to say, okay, maybe both stories are parodying some other earlier non-surviving document, I can show that even if such an unsupported and bizarre claim were true, for someone to arrange those two sets of parallels so that they would form the APTVS pattern, it would still be necessary to have editorial control over both Luke and Jewish War, so this would still mean that Luke originates with the Roman government, because we know Josephus originated with the Roman government, or at least according to Josephus's own autobiography, it does. You know, I personally, and Menescats agrees, that neither one of us believed that Josephus existed at all, and that he was a pen name of some close relative or close friend or whatever of the Caesars. If a critic were to say, okay, but maybe one story is parodying the other, but not vice versa, I could respond by showing evidence that Luke parodies Jewish War, how Jesus' story clearly parodies that of Titus and Vespasian, not only at Lake Galilee, but across the full length of the book of Luke. There are parallels with the entire second half of Jewish War. How a large number of these parallels are in much the same order in both documents. And I can give evidence that Jewish War parodies Luke, how Josephus' story clearly parodies Jesus' story in such incredible detail. Therefore, the reverse parody, and the many-to-one parallels in which one location in Luke is mirrored by multiple locations in Jewish War, all arranged to form the APTVS pattern, requiring editorial control of both Jewish War and the Book of Luke. Other evidence that editorial control of both stories was required includes how the parallels are repeatedly designed to reveal new meaning in Jesus' story, another feat which requires editorial control of both stories, and the way both Luke and Jewish War evoke each step in Exodus 12, which is the ritual of the Passover, and how to prepare the Passover lamb. Yet with the parodies in both stories arranged to form the APTVS pattern, which clearly necessitates editorial control of both Luke and Jewish war. If a critic said, okay, maybe there were a vast number of coincidental parallels and you picked ones to form a pattern either intentionally or otherwise, I could respond by showing, as I will in the next chapter, that the number of coincidental parallels required for this scenario is so great that Luke, despite having only 1151 verses, would need to contain so many noteworthy but coincidental parallels with Jewish war and vice versa that this would fill about 4,000 verses of Luke, which is physically impossible. And by showing, as I will in the chapter, that if we look at those parallels compiled by independent researcher Cliff Carrington a decade ago, we see that even though he only found 25 parallels, which perhaps shows how well hidden they are, the large majority are in precise alignment with the APTVS pattern to the point this would not reasonably happen by chance, and ditto those parallels discovered by Joseph Atwill. Well, he just says the large majority are in precise alignment. Are there some outliers? I'd like to know that. Summary of what this proves. Having so conclusively shown that someone must have had editorial control over both the story found in Luke and the story found in the second half of Jewish war, the latter is unarguably, indeed explicitly, the product of the Roman government under Vespasian and Titus. This proves that the story of Jesus' life as found in the Gospel of Luke originates from the Roman government under Vespasian and Titus. Therefore, it is Roman propaganda originating in their rule between 69 and 81 AD, almost certainly Vespasian's reign 69 to 79 AD. And to sum up why my explanation for this discovery is almost a plain logical deduction based on this discovery. This discovery allows the following logical deductions. And it's now time to turn the page again. That was probably the quickest I've ever gone through a page of this book. Most of the pages are so long. But to summarize more of his evidence, I'm hoping that I might have time for this, but I don't think I'm going to. But let's see. From the mere fact that the Roman government went to such incredible lengths to leave evidence to ensure Jesus' story could later be proven to be fiction, we can deduce that belief in Jesus was not their ultimate goal. The only logical alternative is that their intention was to use Jesus' story as a stepping